Valve have introduced a new weapons update. Their goal is to encourage players to tap shoot instead of bursting. They tried that before, but now they've went a step further and changed the code. What they did is to improve accuracy for slow tapping and decreased accuracy for fast tapping and spraying. They've included this picture showing a slight accuracy increase for the AK when tapping at 250 milliseconds intervals. I wanted to test that. Here's what I did. I changed my mouse settings so that it auto-taps at a time interval when I hold down the left mouse button. Here are the results. Let's check out the M4A1S. At 150 milliseconds, this is very close to the spray. The spray is 100 milliseconds, by the way. At 200 milliseconds, it slightly goes up, so you'd have to pull down, but it's not very inaccurate. It's quite good. At 250 milliseconds, it becomes very usable. 300 milliseconds isn't much of an improvement, but it slightly is. 350 milliseconds is basically as good as the M4A1S gets. For good measure, here are 500 milliseconds. These are as accurate as a single shot that you see on the right. You will see the comparisons at the end of the video, and you could jump to that immediately. Now let's go to the M4A4. M4A4 at 150 milliseconds again is like a spray. Not very good for tapping. 200 milliseconds is basically the same as the M4A1S. Becomes better, but you have to pull down. At 250, it becomes quite usable. At 300, it becomes almost as accurate as a single shot. 350, even better. And for good measure, the 500. Which are again as accurate as a single shot, or almost. Now let's have a look at the AK. The AK-47 in the old version at 150 milliseconds is absolutely not usable. At 200 milliseconds it is quite bad and does a little bit of a spray. 250 milliseconds goes slightly up, so you'd have to pull down to compensate for it. And the AK becomes usable, or became, before the update, became usable with 300 millisecond tapping. 350 is even better than 300, and it becomes one shot accurate at 500 milliseconds. Again, the single shot is on the right. It says as inaccurate or accurate as 500 milliseconds. So you see that basically you would have to go to 300 milliseconds to get somewhat accurate results. Let's compare all of them at 250 milliseconds. Here's the AK at 250 milliseconds. Here's the M4A4, which is in the middle. And the M4A1S on the left. Note that there is basically no significant difference between the M4A1S and the M4A4. They're both as accurate. The AK here has a significantly larger spread than the other two weapons. Here are the weapons after the update. M4A1S at 150 milliseconds is not spraying as much as before, although it's not usable at this speed. At 200 milliseconds, it becomes usable. It's still not super accurate, but it's pretty good. And at 250, I would argue that it becomes quite usable. I will stop at 350 milliseconds because 350 milliseconds is as accurate as a one-shot that you can see on the right. I would argue that even at 200 milliseconds it becomes a quite usable weapon if you pull down ever so slightly. The M4A4 behaves very similar to the M4A1S, and again at 200 milliseconds it becomes usable. .250, .300, and .350 is as good as a one-shot. Comparing these, you see that the one-shot is pretty much as accurate as the spray. The AK-47 is a different story. Note that, unlike before the update, the spray doesn't finish. It stays somewhere in the middle of the spray. It doesn't go to the right. Still, it's completely unusable. At 200 milliseconds, it gets a lot better. It doesn't show even the slightest spraying pattern, but it's still very inaccurate. I would argue that you would have to go to 300 milliseconds, like here, so that it becomes usable at a long range. 350 milliseconds, again, seems to me that it's as accurate as the single shot. Let's look at it. So I would argue that 300 milliseconds is the best choice for the AK. Now let's compare all of them after the update with 250 milliseconds. The M4A1S is almost as accurate as a one-shot. The M4A4 does the same. Whereas the AK is noticeably worse. Not unusable, but worse. Here's the comparison. I have manufactured some pictures for you to look at now to go to a conclusion. Here is the result comparison, as you probably didn't want to go through each and every shot. Let's check out the M4A1S, old and new. New is up and old is down. As you can see, pretty much at 200 milliseconds, it's dead on accurate. The M4A4 is the same thing. At 200 milliseconds, basically you don't have to do anything anymore. Whereas the old version, it's not good. The AK-47 is a slightly different story. As you can see, even in the new version, you need to go to 250 or 300 milliseconds to get accurate results. Now let's look at the 250 milliseconds comparison. Here's the old and new. The AK is improved significantly, and now is pretty good at 250 milliseconds. Basically, the CT rifles haven't changed all that much. It's the AK that was made more accurate. And now tapping with the AK seems more sensible, at least at long range. And you can do it at about 300 milliseconds, which you couldn't before. So, happy tapping. And if you would like to get more rifles comparisons, I guess there are better people than me, but I'd be happy to do another video.